Hello, troublemakers. Does this sound familiar? If this discussion could in any way lead to my being disciplined or terminated or affect my personal work condition, I respectfully request that my union representative, officer, or steward be present at this meeting. Without union representation, I choose not to answer questions. This, listeners, are some form of your wine garden rights. Every person that is protected under a union contract has these rights. Hirsch Harris Weingarten was a poor immigrant from what is now known as Austria Hungary. In 1901, he and his son Joseph opened a grocery store in downtown Houston. Their motto was better food for less. By 1967, there was a chain of stores around Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. By 1972, there were about 100 stores throughout the South. Some of these stores included what was called lobby food operations. At the lobby food operations, you could eat indoors. It was a little bit more fancy. And then there was the takeout. The takeout ones was just exactly what it sounds like. It was just the carry out, and it was carry out only. But that's not who we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the hero of our story, Leura Collins. In 1961, Leura Collins was hired as a salesperson at store number 2. This location was carry out only. Follow me here, carry out only. She worked there for 9 years. In 1970, Leura transferred to store number 98. This location was the fancier lobby style. The salespeople there were represented by Retail Clerks Union. Loss prevention specialists also worked at wine gardens. They worked undercover. They were so deep undercover that management sometimes didn't even know who they were. They were hired to apprehend people suspected of theft. This included employees. In 1972, Leura Collins decided to take some food home. A coworker reported that she saw Leura taking money out of the cash register. The loss prevention specialist assigned was Don Hardy. He staked the place out for a couple of days and reported no findings. After this, it was reported that someone saw Leura take a large box of chicken, which cost $2.98, but they claimed that Leura only put $1 in the cash register. Leura was called to the manager's office. When they got there, Hardy and the manager started in with the questions. Leura, being that union person, asked for her rep, as she should. Let's put a pin in that. If you are protected under a union contract, never speak to management without a union rep. That is my pro tip. But moving on. They were like, that'll be a no, dog. We're just going to keep going with these questions. Leura explained that she was just buying some chicken to take home to her family that night, but because because there were no more small boxes, which would have been the $1 box, she had to use the large box, which would have been $2.98, to hold her order. So Hardy went out and verified with the other employees at the store that they were, in fact, out of small boxes. Then the coworker who reported this admitted that they didn't really know how many pieces Leura had in her box. Hardy came back and was like, sorry, Leura, that's our bad. Looks like this investigation is over. Leura was obviously upset. I mean, she just had her integrity called into question. In the middle of reading them the Riot Act, I like to think that she was reading them the Riot Act, because if she was bold enough to ask for her union steward multiple times during the course of the investigation, a lot of places that you'll read on the internet, they'll say that she was crying and that she made this outburst. But I like to believe that Leura was standing her ground and letting their asses have it. So in the middle of doing this, she yelled out, I ain't never took nothing from y'all. This is in my head that I believe she said. I think she said, I ain't never took nothing from y'all. All I ever got from this place was my free lunch. And Hardy goes, wait a minute. What did you say about a free lunch? And so she was like, yeah, my free lunch. That's all I ever took from this place. Everything else I paid for. And he was like, sit down. Let's talk some more about this free lunch you've been getting. And so she's like, well, can I get my union rep if we're going to open up another investigation on something else? And again, she was denied union representation. Laura explained that one of the perks at working at the store was that employees were entitled to a free lunch. Hardy called headquarters to verify this. They explained that at the takeout stores, follow along here, at the takeout stores where Laura used to work, yes, they were entitled to a free lunch. However, at the sit-down lobby stores, those employees were not entitled to a free lunch. So Hardy did some mental math and he presented Laura with this bill for $160. He said, girl, I called headquarters, ain't no free lunch. Hand me over $160 for all those lunches that you've eaten since you've worked here. Laura refused to sign it. Hardy decided to do a little bit more digging. Turns out pretty much all the employees at store number 98 were getting free lunches because nobody had ever told them that they couldn't. And this included the managers. Rather than admit their mistake and face their embarrassment, Hardy stopped asking the questions and the manager asked Collins, hey, don't worry about all this. We're just going to keep this investigation between us. Laura did not. She went straight to her steward, as she should have. Her union filed an unfair labor practice. The National Labor Relations Board found in favor of Laura Collins. They gave Weingarten a cease and desist order. However, Weingarten, they appealed in the 5th District Court. Weingarten prevailed, and they were not obligated to enforce the cease and desist order that came from the National Labor Relations Board. The National Labor Relations Board appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1975, the courts established what's known as Weingarten rights. Why it's not called Collins rights, I'll never know. So, a quick refresher for those of my listeners who don't know what Weingarten actually establishes. During employer-employee investigatory interviews, the following rules apply. Rule number 1, the employee must make a clear request for a union representative. This can be done before or during the interview. Employees can't be punished for asking for a union rep. Rule number 2, once the employee makes this request, the employer has 3 options. Option number 1, grant the request and stop the questioning until the rep is on the scene. At this time, the rep gets an opportunity to speak with the employee privately. Option number 2, deny the request and end the interview immediately. Option number 3, give the employee a clear choice between having the interview without representation or ending the interview. Option number, well, there's not another option. I gave you 3 options. But rule number 3, if the employer continues interviewing and denies the union rep, it commits an unfair labor practice and the employee has the right to refuse to answer. So listeners, that is the story of Laura Collins and how we got our, what I will forever refer to as our Collins rights. But you guys can keep saying Weingarten rights if that makes you feel better. But Collins rights helps us remember her and it helps us remember her story. I couldn't find any good pictures of her on the internet. Actually, I couldn't find any. And weirdly, I don't know what happened to her. So if any of you guys know like what happened to her, where she is, Like, was she married? Did she have kids? Like, I couldn't find any of this information. Every time I looked her up, Google, anything, like there was nothing, everything attached her to this case. But this person was so much more than this case. So I would love if any of my listeners, any of you internet sleuths, write in, let me know. I'd love to do a follow-up episode where we can actually, discuss this woman's history and, discuss what happened to her, because who she was is more than just this case. And that's the entire point of this podcast, right? Is to humanize some of these people that we read about or haven't read about in books and on paper, right? So moving forward, like I do every week, I would like to give flowers to the people that are here right now that are part of the labor movement and that are important to me. So this week, I want to highlight Patricia, aka Pat Renzing. Pat is who I'm giving my flowers to this week. If you are in the state of Illinois and you are a part of AFSCME Council 31, everyone knows the name Pat. The name Pat is like when you say Beyonce to Americans, right? Because you don't need to say Beyonce Knowles, just like you don't need to say Pat Renzing. Pat is just Pat. Pat started her career as a legal secretary before becoming an insurance investigator for a law firm. She was working as a ward clerk at Washington County Hospital before she was hired onto IDOC in Centralia Correctional Center as a clerk typist 2. From there, she was promoted to clerk stenographer 3. After participating in a classification study, she was reclassified as an office assistant. But Pat appealed this ranking and won. She was then reclassified as the higher paying office coordinator. Pat was part of the group of employees that opened Pinckneyville Correctional Center. Shout out to Local 943. She served as the local's recording secretary and chief steward. Pat retired from the Department of Corrections as a supply 2 after 30 years of service. Pat continues to be an asset to AFSCME for the past 9 years as a staff rep for Council 31. Pat shared with me that the health benefits provided by the union were a blessing for her family. Her daughter was sick as a child, and having the protection of the union contract made a difference in her family's quality of life. Pat has negotiated several contracts for Council 31 Illinois, and for that we are eternally grateful for having a warrior like that on our side. When Pat is not stomping for workers' rights, she is enjoying her twin grandsons, her daughter Suzanne, and her husband of 47 years. Thank you, Pat. Troublemakers, if there's someone in your local or in your union that you want to give flowers to, write to us at resolvedlaborpod@gmail.com. I would be honored to read it on the air in a future episode. resolvedlaborpod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, peace and solidarity. This week's episode of Resolved Labor Podcast is produced by The Create Place Studio. You can find them on all social media platforms at The Create Place STL. We Won is performed by Joe Jinks and written by John O'Connor. This has been Resolved Labor Podcast. As always, peace and solidarity.
Everybody come and join in the union. Begin, begin, begin. Stand together to overcome soon and